Face to face, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. Well, we are just about 50 or so days, maybe a little more, to the next election. And this is a decisive election because now we will have that president and his or her government for the next 5 years. So it's not a decision which anyone can take lightly. Whom do you vote for? So what do the people want? And more specifically, what do the workers of Sri Lanka want? Because it is the workers of this country who will have to drag us out of this financial mess which our political leaders have landed us in over the last several years or decades. So to discuss the requirements, the needs and wants of the workers of Sri Lanka, we have with us in the studio tonight Miss Swasthika Arulingam, attorney at law and president of the United Federation of Labour. Welcome, Swasthika.
Thank you for having me, Niresh.
Now, Swasthika, let's talk about the election. Exciting times, no doubt, but very, very decisive times. We may not get another chance to save our country. And the more input that the voters give to the politicians, the better it is. No more blindly voting and giving 6.9 million votes to one person and saying, he will save the country, he's our savior. None of that. We need to get this right this time from the choices that we have. So from the point of view of the voters, and specifically from the labor force, what do we need from our political leaders? What decisions do they need to take?
I think one of the things which we have seen in the last 40 or 50 years is that consecutive governments and consecutive policies which governments have bought have been tilted or have been biased towards a particular class in society, the elite, the ruling class, the business and political class. And whatever they have been asking has become the policy to the dispossession of the workers or to the detriment of the workers. So for the last 40 years, if you see the manufacturing sector, the export sector workers, or if you see the plantation workers, their lives have not improved. They are still living in line houses. They are still living under horrendous conditions. They are still going into debt, and they are still living under substandard conditions. So this is an indication of the fact that our system has failed our workers, who are in fact tomorrow, if all the export sector workers, the plantation workers, the free trade zone workers suddenly one day decide to go on strike, the country will come to a standstill. Not a single thing can be imported in our country because it is on their earning that our country is surviving. So in this election, what I think workers should demand for, look for, is that any government which comes forward must have a policy which provides for a decent living for wages. A decent and dignified living for wages, which is what for workers, which is what is lacking right now, and where workers can build a future where they have, in terms of their wages, in terms of their earnings, where they have some savings left at the time of retirement, which is not something which workers have right now. This is apart from everything else. But one thing which workers have to also think of in terms of long term, and perhaps not in this election, is that one of the things which workers have not done, perhaps since the fall of the LSSP, is that they have not built a party which represents the interest of the workers, something like what the Labour Party used to be. Labour Party is no longer, it can't be called a workers' party anymore, but what it used to be. So that is also something which workers must think of, form a political bloc of the working class, which is able to decisively demand something from the state, politically demand something from the state. So that is something which workers, I think, have to think. Workers in the sense the working class, peasants, farmers, fishers, all of us collectively must think together in terms of political power.
Now, let's look at our export sector. The business community of Sri Lanka has been crying, saying that exports need to be boosted. Otherwise, this country just can't come out of where it is right now. And it's very true. Our imports are gigantic, and right now there are so many controls on things like vehicles and vehicle imports and so on. But let's forget about the political leadership and the top businessmen. What is the input from the workers as to how our exports can be broadened, can increase rapidly? We of course have our traditional exports rather, that's tea, rubber, gemstones, apparels, and so on and so forth. But what more can we do for those sectors, and what new sectors can we develop?
So one of the things which we have been speaking about amongst trade unions and so on is that our country is focusing on perhaps expanding financialization, and that is what we see in the economic transformation. Now I believe it has been passed. The speaker, I'm not sure whether the speaker has signed on to it, but economic transformation bill. We are looking at expanding financialization, we are looking at a financialized economy, but we are not really looking at a expanding the industrial sector, which is the manufacturing sector. And if you look at all the developed countries, without an exception, all of them focused on industrializing the economy before they even came into a developed state. Our country, if you look at the export sector, as you very correctly said, it's still at a very rudimentary stage. It's still it's functioning on basic principles of industrialization. It has not developed, and workers are not in a position to contribute, because workers for instance, if you take a factory setting, workers are not allowed into decision making spaces. So when you are not allowed into decision making spaces, when you are kept at a particular substandard level, when you are, the only thing which is expected from you is meet the target. I mean, if that is the only thing which is expected from you, then workers are not in a position to contribute to knowledge, and that is what unions are trying to challenge right now. This is also connected to wages. When you keep wages at a depressed level, when workers have to run and run and run in order to earn through overtime payment and so on, you don't have time to think after you work for 12 hours. You go home and you fall asleep. So this is, everything is interconnected. Industrialization, the wages we are paying workers, the kind of working conditions which the business class have created for workers, all of this is interconnected. So that is one of the reasons what unions have been asking and debating over. I mean, I won't say demanding, because demanding always means we are asking something from someone. We have been debating new ideas and principles in terms of what our country's economy should look like in terms of industrialization, because that is the base on which all countries developed historically, and that is something which our current government and consecutive governments have overlooked, perhaps under the prescription of organizations like the IMF, which treats Sri Lanka, when it wants, it treats Sri Lanka like a developed country, and when it wants, it treats Sri Lanka as a complete failure. So this is something which we have to decide for ourselves.
Now, something that often occurs to me is that we have political leaders who talk about boosting agriculture, supporting the farmers, and agriculture, it's wonderful to grow everything, but that's not something which is going to take us out of this mess. We need exports. If we can have agricultural exports, that's great, but by and large we are growing things for our own consumption. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, our political leaders talk about artificial intelligence, AI, the IT sector, and very advanced sectors, which unfortunately, I mean, it's all very well, it's all very catchy and all that, but you're not going to employ 1 million people in the IT sector very soon. It requires skills, it requires a lot of investment. You have to gain a reputation for the country to as a base for IT, which we don't quite have at the moment. So we seem to be stuck at two ends of the spectrum. We have the rudimentary agriculture, and then we have the castles in the air about AI and IT. But why aren't our political leaders focusing on that, the middle ground of factories, of apparel, which which has served us so well for decades, and other industries like that. Is it a lack of knowledge about those industries, or what's going on?
So you have touched on a few issues. One is on this agricultural sector itself. When, for instance, we speak about the agriculture sector, the government is always talking about exports, agricultural exports. But one of the things which we have today, if you see the news and so on, is malnutrition. And it's shameful that in a country like Sri Lanka, where in any place you can grow food, you have an issue called malnutrition in a country like Sri Lanka. So one of the things which farmers and farmers groups have been demanding for a very long time is for the government to focus on food sovereignty and food self-sufficiency in food. And when I say self-sufficiency, it does not mean that I am saying we can grow everything in this country, we don't have to import. That's not what I'm saying. Food sovereignty essentially means that we should be able to, at any given time, we should be able to control the way we eat, and any given time we need to be self-sufficient in the amount of food we have, so that no one will go hungry irrespective of the income status. And that is not impossible. There was a time in Sri Lanka where government, I believe in the 1950s, where the government really did focus on agricultural production and so on. Various things happened and it did not continue, but there was a time when the government did focus on food and ensure that no one goes hungry in this country. So I think that is one aspect of development. When you ensure that your population is well fed with nutritious food and with food free of pesticides and chemicals, then that is one aspect of development. The other aspect is what I spoke about in terms of industrialization. And the third aspect is that I think one of the reasons why we are not moving forward is because when we speak with the business class, when trade unions speak with the business class, the issue always revolves around, for instance, when we are speaking about wages, the business class comes and says, oh, we are making loss. If you listen to the business class, it will look as if for the last 20 years, they have only been making loss, right? So the business class also must think in terms of the interest of the country. It's not only about acquiring mass amounts of profits, it's also about what are you giving back to the country in terms of technology, in terms of development, in terms of developing the space. People speak about productivity, but in order for the productivity to increase, you need to have new machine, you need to have new technology, you need to have training and education. Are these things which our business class is investing on? So this is a question which unions have been raising right now: food security and sovereignty, industrialization, and in terms of investment, what is the kind of investment and reinvestment which the people who have the money in this country, which is the business sector, in terms of the money and in terms of the profit, what is happening to that, what is happening in terms of reinvestment. So these are the three things which we are focusing on in terms of the country's economy.
Now, Swastika, you spoke of wages, and
Yes.
I'm going to come to that, but before that, to me, there are two things. One is the wage that you earn, the other is the cost of living. What do you need to spend just to survive, just to live in a relatively comfortable way for you, your family, and so on. And Sri Lanka's cost of living is enormously high. We have foreigners, even Westerners, who travel to Sri Lanka. They comment on how high our prices are, and this seems so artificial. If something costs $1 to bring from wherever, whether it's, let's say, Singapore, why does it then get sold here for $5? Yes, we have customs tariffs, we do have transportation costs, and of course the importers and so on must make some kind of profit, but surely other countries are doing exactly the same. So they do import and they do sell, but it's not at such an enormously high price, and there is very little use bringing the inflation rate down, because the inflation rate is simply the rate at which things go up. So it's not bringing down the cost of living. So are our unions actually focusing on this aspect?
So I'm not an economist, but I completely agree with what you're saying, particularly in terms of essentials. In terms of, we were speaking about the expenses of sending a child to school. These are something which has, when you do not create a condition in which a family can afford to send a child to school, that is not something which, the implication of that is not something which we see in 1 or 2 years. We are going to see that for the entire next generation. So cost of living is something which the government must be obliged to, or should, the people must demand that the cost of living must come down. And yes, you're right, we calculate inflation on year-on-year inflation, so we don't, it keeps adding up, and we don't really know in terms of the aggregate inflation what it's coming to. So cost of living is it's unbearable. And the other day when I was speaking to some workers in Katunayaka, they said 5 years ago, with the wages we get, we are able to at least save 5,000 rupees. Today we are at a minus when it comes to the end of the month, because our wages have stagnated but the cost of living has gone up. So that is something which the government must there must be something to hold the government accountable to, in terms of stabilizing the economy, in terms of the cost of living, which I don't think has been happening. Because you raised this issue of the cost of living, I also want to state that a large part of our revenue is going into servicing debt, which is also part of the problem in this country, and the government has not done enough to arrest that situation, because there are lots of economists who have come forward since the debt crisis. They have come forward and said we need to renegotiate our terms of how we are going to pay back the debt, and we need to also renegotiate the term of whether we need to pay back all the debt because of the nature of the debt, the giving and the borrowing, how it was done. But we don't see this government doing that, and that is also connected to what we are facing in this country right now.
Well, that's very true. But before we get to the macro side of things, let's look at some of the other costs which the average Sri Lankan, including the workers, needs to bear, which you wouldn't bear in a more rational country. Let's take public transport. It's dismal. Our buses, our trains, they're terrible. You can't possibly rely on them. Women just can't travel in buses. We all know that. So that's a failure. So people are forced to take tuk-tuks, three-wheelers, and that's costly. So it doesn't matter how much money you earn as wages. Your public transport, your transportation bill is quite high, isn't it?
There are I always take this example. Soon after the World War II, the entire European countries was in a state of crisis, right? So they were in a state of crisis, and they were like perhaps something like Sri Lanka, where they did not have money to spend. The economy had gone into a slump and so on. But their economists came forward and said it is during times of crisis that government must step in to spend more in order to expand the economy. The more you spend, the more economy is regenerated, and the more economy grows. So that was when European countries fell into a state of crisis. The economies, their economies are prescribing that they should spend more. The government must step in to invest in the public sector, which the private sector will not do, and so on, right? But in our country, what economists and what international structures are prescribing to us is the right opposite. Cut down on your public expenditure, go into austerity. That is what the IMF is prescribing right now. The more we go into austerity, the more our economy shrinks, and we are not able to come out of this crisis, and of course the people struggle and suffer. So because you raised this specific example of public transport, what I want to say is that Sri Lanka needs to, for instance, in certain rural areas, the only bus which runs in that area is a bus run by the Sri Lanka SLTB, right? So the private sector will not invest in areas where it's not profitable. So the government has to particularly in certain areas, the government has to step in and expand this investment on public transport, trains, buses, and so on. And you very correctly said women are unable to go in buses, because there is a survey which was done by UNDP which says that women who go in public transport, go through 90% of women who go in this transport undergo harassment. So what has the government done to arrest this situation? There was a time when the government said we are going to introduce women only transport, but then the government stopped it halfway. So these are something which the government has to look at. We have to look at examples in countries where the state has stepped in to invest in essential services, for instance like the transport, which has enormously helped the public, which our government is not doing, and even if our government wants to do, through various international financial structures, we are not allowed to do, which is very sad.
And another cost, which I mean, we speak of free education, but our schools really don't do much in teaching and training our youngsters. And when it comes to, at least at the O-level stage, our children, everyone's children in this country, they all go for tuition classes. It could be for the wealthier people, individual classes, but mainly it's these mass classes, and you see those in every town. For example, Gampaha, Nugegoda, they are very famous as tuition towns now. So this is an added cost. Now, if you were living in a more rational country, the schools will teach your children, and you don't have to have this added burden of tuition and so on and so forth. We have so many added costs which you don't need to bear in other countries. Would you say that our labor unions and our political parties, they all need to sit down and figure out, how to rationalize these costs, just as much as trying to earn more money?
There are some costs which I think are essential for any country to bear, the government, the state to bear. One of that cost is the cost of education, because the cost of education is not about how much you're spending on a particular year. It's also about investing in the future of a country. And I think the more we invest in education, the better it is for us in terms of manpower, in terms of labor force, in terms of what we can, we were speaking about industrialization, what the labor, what the workers can contribute in terms of our economy. And there was a time when government was focusing on free education and investing on free education, but along the years, the focus on investing in education, as you very correctly said, in terms of training, in terms of new educational models and so on, that gradually declined, and now it has come to a standstill where there are certain schools which do not even have basic chairs and tables. For instance, in the plantation, there are schools which do not have basic utensils for the teachers to teach. So I would say, yes, the government and the labor unions must sit together and discuss policies, but when unions, for instance the FUTA, which had given so many proposals on education, when unions do propose, and of course the teachers union, policies on education, the government must take that into cognizance and not simply appoint expert committees after expert committees and ignore the research which has been done on the ground. There are several lecturers, there are several teachers who have done reports on what is wrong with our education system and how it can be improved, but those are just put on the sideway. And government, every new government comes in, they appoint an expert committee, like what this government has done in terms of the new education policy. So there are people who have been in this system, who have the actual working expertise to suggest changes to the system, and they have suggested changes, they have produced reports after reports, but the government is not taking what they are saying into consideration. So you're right, labor unions must get involved in policy making and in terms of the larger structures of the country, systems of the country. But when labor unions do propose policies and structures, because they have that industrial expertise, it is also the duty of the government to listen to them and not just appoint empty presidential commissions or committees where people just come out from nowhere and produce expertise which they do not have.
But Swastika, policies are all very well, but they have to show a result. I mean, you could change the education policy, but if at the end of the day, in 3 years or 5 years, the students who are coming out of schools simply have not improved, then your policies have failed. So it's the same thing in every aspect of state involvement, whether it's education or public transport or law and order. It's the same thing. You know, we are told that 5,000 new buses will be put on the road, but then when it comes down to it, is our public transport better today than 5 years ago? I don't think so. Would you agree?
When I say policy, I do not mean what we have been seeing in terms of our governments. One government comes and says one thing, then the next government overturns it. Within the one government, they come up with a policy, then when they go to implement, it's something completely different, and so on. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, for a long period of time, at least since I am aware of, like for the last 10 years, there have been people who are in the industry, for instance in the education sector, in the health sector, who have done studies. They are in the sector, so they know the day-to-day problems in the sector. They have studied, they have submitted reports to governments, they have done research on it. But the government, the consecutive, it's not just one government, right? Consecutive governments have been so arrogant that they have not taken industry experts and people who have been in sector experts. When they have produced documents to build a collective change in policy, the government has not taken that into account, and that is one of the reasons. You're exactly right. The policy document, election manifesto says we are going to produce 5,000 buses, then you don't see it, because you can't guide a country by the whims and fancies of individuals. It's a collective decisions. One person or 225 people or 100 people sitting in the cabinet cannot change the course of this country, and that is why the government must be accountable to the people and to people in sectors who are putting forward policies and documents which the government is completely ignoring. And not only this government, consecutive governments.
We'll cross over for a short commercial break now, and we'll be right back.
Your opportunity to change your destiny. සඳහි දක්ෂිණ ද්‍රවයට ගොඩ පැසූ අතර මේ ඔවුන්ගේ චන්ද්‍ර ගවේෂණයේ පළමු මෙහෙයුමයි. Bring us to Witness Season 4 Saturday at 6:30 p.m. on TV1.
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are in conversation with Attorney at Law Swasthika Arulingam, President of the United Federation of Labour, and we are discussing the needs of the workers of Sri Lanka in the context of our presidential election, which is coming up, as we know, on the 21st of September. Not very long to go. Swastika, has your federation, your United Federation of Labour, have you met with the major candidates and had discussions about what the country needs?
No, we have not met with the political candidates as such, or even with parties. One of how we engage in policy and how we engage in politics is by engaging with the public. So our statements, our positions, the positions we take, everything is in the public, and we have public seminars and so on. So it's more towards the public that we say this is the position and this is how we try to influence policy, rather than meeting with individual parties and persons. But in the past, on certain crucial moments, for instance when the EPF debate was going on, so on, we went and met members of parliament to raise our concerns. So strategically we meet people, but in these elections we have not particularly done that.
Right. Now let's get to the subject of wages, which came up last week actually, because the wages board of the country came out with a new minimum wage for this country, and that seems to be shockingly low. It is, I believe, 17,500 rupees per month for a worker, and this is across all trades. And the earlier minimum wage was something like 12,000.
12,000 plus the budgetary relief allowance, which adds to 16,000.
Right. So let's just pause to think: is this enough? Is 17,500 rupees enough? Because well, a family unit, to my knowledge, consists of 5 people. You have 2 parents who are working. Both parents nowadays have to work. Then you probably have 2 children. That's around the median. And because the parents are working, at least for about 10 years of the lives of the children, you need a grandparent living with that family. So you've got a 5-member family, which I think is very much the norm in Sri Lanka. And you have 2 salaries. So if you have 2 salaries of 17,500, that's 35,000 rupees per month for 5 people, or 7,000 rupees per month for 1 person. What is going on? How do they even calculate this? I mean, I'd like to know how they came to this, because we'll get to this comparison with other countries, but how do they calculate this?
So what the minister has announced is that he is going to make an amendment to the National Minimum Wage Act, and it was 12,500. Now he's going to increase it to 17,500, and then of course we have the budgetary relief allowance of 3,500, so it adds up to 21,000. Now, as you very correctly said, on what basis do they come up with this? There is no basis on which they have increased the minimum wage to collectively. I am going to speak collectively, because even the 16,000 was a collective amount, 21,000, because as you very correctly said, in this day and age, how can you live on? If let's say everything else fails, you need to have at least 21,000. How can that is the point of minimum wage, right? It's about, can you live on that wage? Minimum wage is basically living wage. Can you live on that wage? So 21,000 you can't live. And what I want to also want to speak about the position of the UFL is that United Federation of Labour is that we looked at the central bank report for 2024, and the central bank says that for a family of 4, now how they came up with the family of 4 is a different question, but for a family of 4 to survive in this economic context, you need an average of a minimum of 103,500 or something of that sort. So even the central bank is saying that for a family to survive, you need 103,500, around 103,500 rupees. So when we divide that by the earning unit, which is 1.8 in a family, it comes to around 57,000, an average of 57,500. So this is the government's own conservative statistics. On a conservative statistics, the average minimum wage should be rupees 57,500, and that is what we have been asking for. Whether the government can pay, whether the private sector can pay or not is a different question, which we have to deal with differently. If they can't pay that amount, then should the cost of living go down? All of that we have to debate and discuss separately. But on the government's conservative estimate, the minimum wage must be rupees 57,500. But what has the minister done? He has proposed an amendment to the Minimum Wage Act by saying he is going to make it 17,500, and now a person is supposed to survive in this day and age for 21,000. So it is, of course, you very correctly said when you said how did they come up with this number. No one knows how they came up with this number. Even back in 2021, unions were asking for a minimum wage of 26,000, even back in 2021. So now the minister coming and saying that the minimum wage is going to be increased by 17,500 is basically is a mockery of the workers and of the amount of labor they are putting into this country to ensure that this country doesn't drown. It's a mockery of the work the laborers have put in, the workers have put in.
Now there's the minimum wage, which is the official government minimum, and then there is what we call a living wage, which is what you need to earn to live. So as you pointed out, the government's own statistic of the living wage is 57,000.
They have not that is our calculation, but
right.
Central Bank has come and said it's around 103,500 for a family of 4 to survive.
Right. So this seems, I mean, it's perhaps 35% of what you need to earn to live, and to live means food, medicine, transportation. Yes. Everyone needs a mobile phone. rent, school books, clothes, school uniforms, shoes for children. Those things are all required, right? So how they come up with 17,500 plus something which makes it 21,000 is certainly very, very debatable. I mean, it is not anywhere close to what is needed, is it?
That is so. And what you mentioned before in terms of we were speaking about policy, right? And how these consecutive governments have been coming up with policy, and this is the exact problem. How did you come up with this 17,500? I mean, isn't the labor minister living in this country? I mean, doesn't he know the situation in this country and what people are going through? So that is the exact problem. You have a reality on the ground, then the government, influenced by certain lobbies, comes up with a completely unrealistic figure, and then we are stuck with it. We are stuck with it, and then everyone suffers because of that. And that is precisely the problem in this country.
So these are the points which our next president needs to ponder long and hard, because there's no point becoming president and presiding over what would be pretty much the destruction of the country, because for 5 years the new president has to govern. I'm not going to say rule. Rulers are for kings and emperors. This is governance. They are being voted into office. The president, the prime minister, the cabinet, all of them, and they need to think long and hard about these facts and how they are going to achieve them. I mean, I'm not saying that wages need to be up to 50,000 immediately. That's not it. But there are policies, there's the cost of living and so on, transportation and so on and so forth, which has to be looked at holistically. Wouldn't you agree?
One of the things which you emphasize in your questions is this policy factor, right? So I just want to give one of the most recent examples as how our government comes up with policies. So you remember on May Day, the president came and announced and said that plantation workers, their wages are going to increase to 1,700.
Yes, what happened to that?
Right? He came and announced that. Even when he was announcing that, many of us in the union movement, we were watching that and saying, this is not a legal announcement. This is going to be challenged, and the president is a lawyer. When for instance, when his electoral issue gets challenged, then he comes up with all kinds of constitutional arguments, right? Putting constitutional amendments. So he knows that when he made that announcement, this is not a announcement made on following the proper procedure. And yet the president and the labor minister goes and makes the announcement. They publish the gazette. They raise the hope of workers. Workers worked for almost 1 month thinking that they're going to get the 1,700. There were regional plantation companies which went and promised workers that we are going to increase your wages. And while making the promise, they go and challenge this gazette in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal, for whatever reason, for reasons known to because I have not seen the order, does not allow for interim allowance, relief. Then they go and the regional plantation companies appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court suspends the functions of there were 3 gazettes which have come in, so 2 of the gazettes they suspend. So therefore then what the plantation companies do, they go back to the workers and tell them, now the matter is in the Supreme Court, so we can't increase your wages until the Supreme Court determines the matter. Then what does the government do? 2 days back the government has, or yesterday or day before, the government has come up with a new gazette. Now the labor minister is saying, I withdraw the powers given to the labor commissioner to determine the minimum wage for the rubber and tea sector. Now, as if the minister did not know this when he initially gave powers to the labor commissioner, as if the minister did not know that he was overstepping the law when he actually went and did this. So the government, when they made this announcement on Workers' Day, knowing very well that the regional plantation companies are not going to be sitting very happily and say we are going to suddenly pay 1,700, knowing that, they go and make this announcement, get the hopes of workers up, and then as expected the regional plantation companies go and challenge. Of course they go and tell court that we can't pay these wages and so on. So that the hypocrisy of the regional plantation companies is a completely different story. But I'm talking about what the government has done in terms of giving this message and this hope to plantation workers who are hoping for this wage raise. So what has been happening in this country is I would say, from what I have seen in this plantation sector, the saga which has gone on in terms of the wages, is that there is a lot of complicity and lobbying when it comes to workers and the rights of workers and the protection of workers and the fact that workers have a right to decent living. There's a lot of complicity which is going on in the political and business elite, and that complicity is getting reflected every time in policy making, and that is one of the reasons why we do not have a coherent policy. We do not have a rationale for why the Labour Minister suddenly comes and says we need to increase the minimum wage to 70,500. That is why there is no rationale in the Labour Minister, without following the correct process, goes and announces on May Day that they are going to increase the minimum wage to 1,700, and then 2 months later they are putting another gazette reversing the entire decision, and the workers are left completely without any kind of with disappointment, I would say.
So was this a bit of a farce on the part of the President, the Minister and so on, to make that announcement prematurely when things were not clearly going to happen in that way? Was it just political grandstanding?
There are two issues here. The first issue is, yes, on the government side it was a complete farce, because the government cannot claim that they did not know the law. So on the government side, yes, it was a complete farce, and that is why now they have chickened out of it and they have pulled back the gazette. On the regional plantation company side, we have to speak about that also. Whether the wage is 1,000 or whether the wage is 1,700, it is only the minimum wage. If the regional plantation company wants, no one, absolutely no one is preventing the regional plantation companies from paying 1,700 or 2,000 or whatever it is that they want to pay to workers. So then we have to turn around and ask the companies, is it fair for you to come in this day and age and even go and file a case in court? Let's say the decision has come out wrongly, leave out that. But in terms of fairness and justice, is it fair for you to come to court and say we can't pay 1,700 minimum wage to a person in this day and age? So that is a completely different matter. Regional plantation companies, I was reading the petition, they have come out and said that that they have gotten into this because when the plantations were nationalized, they were making loss. So then it became privatized. So we took over, and we have been providing for housing, and we have been providing creches and all for workers. So we are actually doing this good job, but we can't pay 1,700. But if you actually look at the state of the housing in the estate, those are line houses. If you just enter the line house, you will see the state of the houses where roof is coming off, where the houses are leaking. Is horrendous, the condition which people are living in. And that is what regional plantation companies, while making billions in profits, have done to the plantation workers. So we have to look at from both sides. On the side of the government, when it plays out this farce to cheat workers one more time, we all remember the EPF scandal which happened. So that is on the side of the government. Then on the side of the regional plantation companies, they are going and making an argument before court saying that they can't pay 1,700, and that is also a farce. That is also a complete exploitation and dispossession of workers.
So let's get back to the minimum wage issue, Swasthika. And I was doing a little bit of research online, and we in Sri Lanka seem to be paying our workers, or rather the minimum wage which the government expects us to pay the workers, seems to be very far short of neighboring countries, even in South Asia. Of course, thankfully, I think most private sector companies are paying much above the stipulated minimum wage. But why we have such a low minimum wage is the point to ponder, and not just to ponder, it should be brought out and discussed in many forums. Some of the figures I have, India, and I've converted it into Sri Lankan rupees. India is 19,300 per month. That's the minimum wage. But of course, the cost of living in India is far lower than in Sri Lanka. So therefore, comparatively, our people are actually earning less. Bangladesh is 32,300. Nepal is 39,100. Malaysia is 97,700, and so on and so forth. So it's quite shocking that Sri Lanka's official minimum wage is so low, while our cost of living is so high. These are issues. Whom do you leave this up to in the end? Is it the wages board which sits, is it annually?
So there are few things when it comes to comparison of wages. One is the official wage itself, and the other is the wages which companies decide to pay workers, right? So that comes through various means. It comes through wages board, when the wages board is summoned. It comes through the national minimum wage. It comes through certain industry standards which are being set, and of course it comes through collective agreements. So private sector, our country's by and large our economy relies on the engine of our economy is the private sector since the liberalization. So I would say that private sector and the state today, in today's context, I mean, we're not living in the 50s and the 60s. So in today's context, the fact that the wages are depressed, the fact that the government is only able to come out and say the collective minimum wage, including the budgetary allowance and so on, is going to be 21,000, is a complicity between. That is why I keep talking about the elite, right? There's a complicity between the political elite as well as the business sector. And when I say business sector, I mean the power players in the industry. There's a complicity where you keep the official wage at a particular level. So beyond, then they could come and say, no, in our company we pay this much, in our company. That is not the point. The minimum wage is supposed to be the living wage in this country. And when the minimum, when the living wage, when the government comes and confidently says we're going to keep the living wage at 21,000 rupees, then you're going to come up with, when people are going to come up with these comparing statistics. Even recently, one of a Japanese organization did a comparison between their companies in the Asian and Oceanic region, and they came, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest wages in the entire region. So in terms of answering the question on who is responsible, I would say who is running the market. The market is run by being run by two players. One is the private sector, and then the state intervenes as well. So both must be collectively responsible in answering the question as to why the Sri Lankan government cannot confidently come and say in Sri Lanka we can have a minimum wage of 57,500, which is their own number. Why can't you confidently come and say that? Because of the way in which the market is run and the way in which various players come in to influence the market to keep the wages at a depressed level. And that is something which we have to seriously think about.
Now, from a national point of view, with the terrible situation that the country is in, it is vital that we keep our skilled labor here at home. There's no point in our skilled people just migrating or going off to the Middle East and coming back in 20 years' time or whatever, and when we can't use their skills to build up the economy back home. That seems imperative. And if the wages are going to be so low and the cost of living is going to be so high, how do you retain these people? The brain drain will kill us over the next few years. So it doesn't matter who the president will be come 2 months from now, because that president will need to deal with these issues and think long and hard before becoming president of how he or she is going to deal with this and what the policies will be.
So few things which I was thinking about when you were speaking is that if you want to retain workers or employees or so on, the country has to, the economy has to build. It's not, people don't stay behind in a country out of the goodness of their heart. Ultimately everyone wants to thrive and have a future. So if you want to ensure that the productive or the skilled labor is going to remain in this country, few things which you have to do. Taxation. Today the taxation, everyone is being taxed, both indirect and indirect taxation. Taxation has to be relooked at in terms of who is being taxed and at what level are you going to start taxing. So that is one thing. Secondly, one of the calls of the 2022 Aragalaya was bring back the stolen money. The government has not moved 1 inch in terms of tracing where the money has gone. 2 years ago, unions raised the issue where because of the fact that we don't have financial controls, export and import sector companies are keeping money outside in offshore accounts under this concept called misinvoicing and transfer pricing, which is basically financial fraud. The central bank has done nothing to investigate what has happened in the past few years in terms of the money which has gone abroad and been kept abroad, I would say illegally, I would say unjustly, I would say. So there are things which we should do in terms of retaining the money which the workers are earning, which the government is not doing enough. There are also things which we should do in terms of encouraging workers, for instance in terms of taxation. And we should also think of where and who can be taxed, which is something the government does not want to, the discussion the government does not want to go into, because if you really look at the question of whom we should tax, who has the money to be taxed, then it would very much fall into that political bracket which the what do you call the current politicians rely on in terms of their voter bank, the voter finances or the election finances and so on. So these are issues which we have to think of as a country as a whole, but this is not something which is going to come out of thin air. There has to be an overhaul of the system. That is what we hope in every elections. But as people also, we should not think that we can vote for a particular government into power and just watch them, that's never going to happen. We have to keep democracy alive. We have to keep questioning. And I think that is what changed with the Aragalaya. What changed with the Aragalaya was people started questioning the status quo on a continuous basis, even with arrest, even with detention, even with the CID calling and questioning them. People started questioning the status quo, and that is why, for instance, when Ranil Wickremesinghe came back and said we have gotten into the best deal in terms of the external debt restructuring, we all questioned it. What is this best deal when we don't even know what is the deal you have been entered into? Even Parliament has not been presented with the deal which you have entered into with the external creditors. So these are something which we would not have seen so much before the Aragalaya. But with the Aragalaya, I think the political culture changed, where now governments are being forced to be transparent, whether they like it or not. And I think that is a step forward in terms of our democracy.
So it's interesting that you pointed out that we need to continuously question the decisions and the policies, because in the last election there was someone who came up with something called the vistas of prosperity and splendor, and the only vistas we saw were about 1 million people on golf race green 2 years later, who basically chased that president out of his house and out of the country. But we simply can't be doing that all the time. The next president, we can't be chasing him or her out of the country in 2 years' time. Then we become like one of those South American republics, and they get nowhere. We all know that. So basically, you're quite right that we need to keep a close eye on what our political leaders are doing. But my final question is, we've all tried to do this in the last 2 years. The media, the civil society watchdogs, labor unions such as yourselves. Is there anything more that can be done to ensure that the politicians who govern from November would actually do a better job?
I think the reason I mentioned the Aragalaya is that before, as you very correctly said, with the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election, there were two issues, right? People were looking at him and thinking that he is going to come and save the country. One man, it doesn't matter from where, one person cannot save an entire institution, entire structure which has been created for decades, right? So it's not about individuals, it's about structures and system, and how we challenge those structures and system, and how we democratize and make those systems open to the public, right? So that is the lesson which we learned with Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election in terms of governance, in terms of how democracy functions. And I say that after the Aragalaya, people started really interrogating financial policies of the government, economic policies of the government, and I think that is a step forward in terms of our democracy. The other aspect, because you mentioned Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election, the other aspect is the reason why Gotabaya Rajapaksa was able to get so many million votes. He came on a platform of racism. And that is something which has always plagued our country, not only in terms of the upper classes, but also in terms of the working classes and so on. So racism is something which we need to consciously and consistently challenge, all of us. The media, civil society unions, we have to challenge it. Because if we do not get rid of that plague called racism, again and again, divide and rule, dictators will come to power, and then we have to, as you said, we have to stand in Godface Green trying to get him out. So that is the second aspect of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's presidency, where we need to question the race issue and the question of racism in this country.
And I'm afraid we are out of time. Swasthika Arulingam, Attorney at Law and President of the United Federation of Labour, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's been a pleasure having you once again, and we hope to have you back as soon as possible. And to you at home, thank you very much for watching. Don't go away. The news is coming up next, which these days is excitement going on and on and on with this particular election coming up. So stay tuned, and God bless, and have a good night.